me out with your smile. Like the sunshine brings the light. Fill me out with a flame. I will let you in this game. Take me out where I'm down. 'Cause with you I'm safe and sound. 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 Safe and
attention, everyone.
I've been trying to catch the Pontiac Bandit for 8 years. You know how many months that is?
96.
80, 46 years, months.
You're not very good at math.
Oh God. Oh my God.
Oh God. Okay,
my
no,
God.
it's in here. It's in here. Oh, it's in my shirt.
I was gone for 30 seconds.
Dad.
You going out with your friends Friday night, right?
Oh, well, we didn't talk yet, but I don't need...
Yeah, I can go. Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, I could go. Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah.
Here's the plan. You sneak past the guards and grab the treasure.
What are you gonna do?
I'm gonna shop at thriftbooks.com, but there's millions of books for under $5.
Even adventures?
Adventures, fantasy, anything.
Okay, new plan.
Whatever you do it for less at Harbor Freight.
All right. I need to get a haircut. All right, here we go. We are just gonna have a pretty chill day. It's gonna be pretty pretty short stream. We're going to start off with what we always start off with, which is a sermon about this week's Bible passage. This week's Bible passage is Leviticus 25, 1 through 7. So we're going to watch a sermon on that while we play Game of Risk. Here we go.
For any length of time, then you know that it does not take long for you to see that the Sabbath is pretty important, right? I mean, you start to pick up on that right away, and for good reason, too, because the Sabbath is mentioned right at the very beginning on the seventh day of creation, God's original Sabbath, the day he rested from everything that he had made. And then as you continue to work your way through the Bible and you get into the next book, the book of Exodus, you see God commanding his chosen people to remember the Sabbath day, to honor it, and to keep it holy as a day of rest unto the Lord. And Sabbath observance is so important in God's economy that remembering the Sabbath day is listed as commandment.
Uh-oh.
Number 4 in the 10 Commandments. It's important. I mean, to God, Sabbath is a big deal, and he wants his people to recognize the significance of the Sabbath. So let's look at Exodus chapter 20, and we'll pick up in verse 8. This is commandment number 4 in the 10 Commandments.
I wonder why.
Commandments. says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. That is, remember. You recall. You bring to the forefront of your mind what this day is all about. And he says in verse 9, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested. He Sabbath.
I don't know why my internet's been so bad lately. It has just been absolutely terrible. Let's try restarting this.
In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested. He Sabbath the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. He sanctified it. He made it holy, and he set it apart as something altogether special and different from the other days of the week. And Israel is commanded to remember it. Bring it to the forefront of your mind what this day is about. So they would remember and then even abstain from work. And have you ever thought to yourself, why is the Sabbath so important? I mean, what is the big deal about remembering Saturday, right? What's the big deal about not working on Saturday? And if it is such a big deal that it's coming up this many times in the Bible, and God has listed it as number 4 on his top 10 list of commandments, then why does it seem like most Christians seem to slough it off? Why does it seem like when I look around at the church, it's like the Sabbath is not really a big deal? Why does it seem like that? Well, those are great questions. And this morning, I really do hope that by God's grace to provide you guys with some biblical answers to those questions and lay a good foundation.
I don't know why he didn't take this 3 and go in there instead of he went this way. That was a very weird move.
In this chapter, we are introduced to yet 2 more types of required Sabbath observance for Israel. The Sabbath year and the Jubilee. And both of them required Israel taking an entire year off of work. That's right. An entire year of resting. And the Jubilee would come around once every 50 years. And Israel would take that year off. And then all kinds of other things, all sorts of restoration and bringing people back to their inheritance happened on that day. We'll talk more about that next week. But the Jubilee is the Sabbath of Sabbaths. But we're going to focus in upon what is the Sabbath all about and what is this year-long Sabbath all about. Hopefully by the end of the study, we walk away with a better understanding of why the Sabbath is so important to God and his plan of redemption, and why it is that Jesus alone can provide us with a true and better Sabbath rest. So Leviticus chapter 25, starting in verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. What grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine. For it is a year of rest for the land, and the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you. For you, your male and female servants, your hired man, the stranger who dwells with you, for your livestock and the beasts that are in your land, all its produce shall be for food. Now, most people know about Israel's weekly Sabbath observance. That is, that Saturday, the last day of the week, the 7th day, is a day of rest. The last day of God's creation, and on that day he rested, and all of creation entered into that rest. But not so many are familiar with Israel's sabbatical year. So in addition to observing a weekly Sabbath, every 7th year, Israel took off. Now, just as a little side note, sometimes I can run into people that are really hung up in a legalistic way about observing the Sabbath day. You got to do it. I mean, if you don't just take the day off and I mean, if you do any work on it, God's going to be absolutely displeased with you. And so you got to do it. In fact, you know, it's right there in the commandments. And so we need to make sure we're keeping the Sabbath. We got to do it exactly the way that God prescribed it for Israel. That's what we need to be doing. And I, in turn, begin to ask them, well, the Sabbath is that important? Are you making sure that you keep the Sabbath year too? Are you taking the entire year? I mean, if we're going to do it, let's go all the way and let's make sure we take the Sabbath year as well and honor the Jubilee as well. We better do exactly what God prescribed for Israel. But I think you'll see in a moment,
I don't know why.
at least by the end of the study, I hope you guys see that there is a true and better way to embrace the Sabbath and honor the Sabbath by turning to Jesus, who is our true and better rest. But we now come to Leviticus 25, where we are introduced to the Sabbath year and the Jubilee. Now, God has already introduced the children of Israel to this topic. He did so even back in the book of Exodus. But here, now, at the end of Leviticus, this is mentioned to drive home the importance and the significance of Sabbath for God's people. And once Israel entered the promised land, Israel was to honor and to trust the Lord, not just by observing the 7th day, but by observing the 7th year too. On the 7th year, Israel was not to work for that year, and the land could not receive any organized work. Now, Israel could glean provisions from what the untouched land simply provided for them of their own accord for food. So it's like, oh, we're hungry. You can walk out into the field and grab something and have some food for that day. But there was to be no farming, no sowing, no pruning, no reaping whatsoever allowed in the Sabbath year. The land had to lay in a fallow state. Additionally, all foreign servants, hired help, strangers, and all animals in the land were required to honor the Lord by entering that year of rest too. An entire year of rest. Now that sounds really quite amazing, doesn't it? That sounds awesome. How come my job, is not providing me with a sabbatical year every 7th year? I mean, come on. That sounds great. As amazing as that sounds, the reality is there are very few indicators that Israel ever kept the sabbatical year in a regular basis as they were supposed to. And that's when you take a look at Israel, even pre-Babylonian captivity and post-Babylonian captivity. They never really honored this in the way that God intended them to. In fact, it was Israel's failure to keep the Sabbath year that was one of the chief reasons, among many others, that led them into Babylonian captivity. And it was the years that they failed to observe that determined the amount of time that they were going to spend in Babylon, which was 70 years. Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 36, and we'll pick up in verse 18. It says, "And all the articles from the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his leaders, all these he took to Babylon." This is the laying siege of Jerusalem, plundering and tearing down the temple, taking away their artifacts. And it says in verse 19, "Then they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years." Now notice, in our text right there, the emphasis is upon the land enjoying her Sabbaths. Now, this is a very clear reference to Israel's sabbatical year, something Israel failed to observe in a massive way. And did you notice in verse 2 of Leviticus chapter 25 that the emphasis for the sabbatical year is upon the land receiving rest? Look at verse 2. "When you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord." Now, the weekly Sabbath that we read of in Exodus chapter 20, that Sabbath was given with an emphasis upon the people of God resting. But the Sabbath year is given with an emphasis upon the land resting. And notice again in verse 4, "In the 7th year there shall be a solemn rest for the land." Now, yes, people and animals and servants were to rest too, but the emphasis given to us in the text is upon the land resting. And since Israel was going to be punished for 70 years because they had failed to keep and to honor those sabbatical years the way that God had prescribed them, well, then you can work out the math and figure out how long they have been disobedient to this command. You just take the 70 years of captivity that they're being punished for, multiply that by 7 groupings of years, and then you can figure out that 70 times 7 works out to 490. That's a 490-year period of history where Israel did not keep the Sabbath year. Now, Israel was in the Promised Land for roughly 800 years from the time that they entered under Joshua's leadership until the time that they were taken into captivity by Babylon, which tells us that if Jeremiah's judgment given to Israel for not observing her Sabbath years included the entire time from Joshua until captivity, that means that Israel observed less than half of the required sabbatical years. And that's best case scenario, folks. That is really a best case scenario for Israel ever honoring the Sabbath year the way that God required. Less than half, but it could be far less than that if the timing of Jeremiah's prophetic judgment does not include the time that Israel needed to complete her conquest in the Promised Land, which was about 7 years, so you could knock off one more. And if God is graciously handing out partial credit during the time of the judges. I would suspect that under Joshua's leadership that Israel would have kept at least one sabbatical year. And when it comes to the period of judges, you and I are all too familiar with Israel's history during that time. It's not good. It's a bleak time in Israel's history, but it is marked with spots of faithfulness. Some revival in certain areas because certain judges were raised up. And those spotty areas of faithfulness did last for some time, and perhaps in those areas they observed keeping the Sabbath year. So it could be that God is just handing out some partial credit. I think he's merciful and gracious and kind that way. And if that is the track record for Israel keeping the sabbatical year, what about the Jubilee? The one that came every 50 years. Well, the chances are Israel never faithfully observed the Jubilee. Israel never observed the Sabbath of Sabbath. This glorious, grand year of renewal and restoration. It's highly doubtful that Israel ever observed it once. And the fact is, we have no historic record whatsoever of Israel ever keeping a Jubilee. That's pretty sad, because as we'll see, we'll move forward into next week. It is a beautiful picture of redemption and restoration. But just because Israel never kept the end of her bargain, that does not mean that the purposes that God intended to teach Israel through these year-long Sabbaths was not tremendously important, right? They were altogether important, wonderfully important, and redemptively significant because they ultimately point us to Jesus. They point us to the restoration that's to come in Messiah, God's plan to bring about a complete and total restoration of all things. And just so that you can follow the emphasis of Sabbath rest in our text, we are going to highlight once again what every Sabbath observance was to look back to. And you'll recall there in Exodus 20 and verse 8, they were to remember, to recall. Recall what the Sabbath is all about. That's the paramount thing in that command. Recall what the Sabbath is all about, and here's the other ways you're going to honor that: by not working, by resting. So we're going to look back to what every Sabbath observance looks back to, looking back to Adam and Eve and all of creation for that matter, entering into complete and total rest with God, enjoying the fullness of his presence. Adam and Eve walked with God, talked with God, enjoyed God, and all of the work that they did in the garden stemmed out of the overflow of that enjoyment, of that peace, of that rest that they had with God. So turn with me back to Genesis chapter 1. And I want you to see something when it comes to the days of creation. You and I know that God created everything in 6 days. 6 days God created the heavens and the earth and everything that exists in them. And on the seventh day, he rests. But I want you to see how all of creation was intended to enter into that seventh day. All of creation was intended to enter into that day of rest and remain in a state of unbroken enjoyment of God himself. Everything flowing out of that. Notice in chapter 1, after each day of creation, you can just track along and see for yourself that days 1 through 6, there is mention of evening and morning were the first day. After every day, evening and morning was day 1, evening, morning, day 2, evening, morning was day 3, evening, morning was day 4, all the way on through. But when you get to Genesis 2, and we talk about the seventh day, we see that it's hallowed, it's set apart, it's described differently, and it doesn't come with an evening and a morning or day 7. So Genesis 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had done. He rested. That is, he Sabbathed on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. And then God blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it. He made it's set apart, it's completely different from any of the other days, because in it he rested from all his work which he had created and made, i.e., this is the state that God intended all of creation to remain in and enjoy forever. This is the history of the heavens and the earth, when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And you will notice that there's no mention of evening and morning when it comes to the seventh day. Now, that does not mean that there was not an evening and morning on the seventh day. There most certainly was. The earth spun around just like it did, and there was evening and morning on the seventh day, but there's no mention of it in the text. And that's because Hebrew scholars tell us this is a literary way, a literary device that's used to show God's intention for Sabbath rest to be unending. It's to be unbroken. All of the other days, everything else that he made was to enter into this Sabbath. Think about that. Adam and Eve, they enjoyed unending, nonstop communion and peace. They were at complete and utter rest in God's presence. There was no division between them and God. A complete peace, complete unity, complete harmony, and all that they did and all of their labors, it stemmed out of that. That's God's original intention. And out of the overflow of that rest, their relationships with one another blossomed, their work blossomed, but sin entered the picture. And sin, once it entered on in, brought a disruption to this initial rest. It created a massive problem. It disrupted the rest that humanity enjoyed in the very presence of God himself. And because of sin, humanity would be cut off from God's presence, severed from God's presence. Because of sin, the land suffered. Thistles, thorns, hard ground has to be broken up, all because sin has entered in. And because of sin, God announces another work. He's no longer at complete rest because of sin. God announces another work. He announces the work of redemption. Genesis chapter 3, verse 14. So the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, you are cursed more than all cattle and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. Verse 15. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise or crush, or bruise his heel. Now, he shall bruise your head. The idea is he'll crush your head, and you'll afflict his heel. Now, who is it that will put enmity? Who is it that will work to put enmity between the serpent and the woman? The Lord. The Lord God Almighty is announcing that. I will put enmity. I will go to work. And ever since that pronouncement of work, humanity has been waiting to enter back into a state of complete rest in the fullness of God's presence. God wants to redeem us back to a state of complete and total Sabbath rest with himself. Unbroken intimacy, face-to-face fellowship with him. Everything we do flowing out of that rest and that peace and that fellowship that we have with God. Sin has broken that. And we need to be restored back to that rest. Now, why is it that we do not hear a command to observe the Sabbath until the Exodus? Well, because it wasn't until the Exodus that God's manifest presence was once again established amongst humanity, dwelling amongst humanity once again. Israel, through the tabernacle, had the presence of the living God dwelling in her midst. So Israel through the Mosaic covenant was recapturing, at least in part, a little piece of what was lost in Eden. The living God dwelled in Adam and Eve's midst. They could approach God, commune with God, fellowship with God. Sin entered in, that was broken. And now, through this covenant and through this people, a little bit of that is being reestablished. Israel, through God's gracious covenant provision, could once again draw near to God's presence and commune with him. And so every Sabbath was to be hallowed and remembered as a part of Israel's covenant. And it was to honor God and worship him in light of his goodness and his redemption. And yet, there was a recognition and a remembrance on Israel's part when they thought back to the 6 days of creation and when God rested, that there's still got to be a better Sabbath that's yet to come. Because God has promised to crush the head of the serpent and destroy him and all that has been introduced into the world through sin, and thus returning humanity and all of creation to a complete Sabbath rest once again. So we go, there is still a fuller Sabbath yet to come. And hence these year-long Sabbaths that Israel is to embark upon as well. A fuller, a more completed Sabbath. And those are just a picture of the better Sabbath that is to come in Jesus. I hope you can see that the Sabbath is at the very heart of God's redemption. It's God's desire to see fallen humanity ushered back into a complete, fully restored Sabbath rest with him once again. And this is why there is such a strong emphasis upon keeping the Sabbath, because the Sabbath rest is the heartbeat of God's intention and desire and original purpose for creation. That's how he created it. And sin broke that, and so now he's working to redeem that and restore that. The latter part of Leviticus has been driving home these last few chapters that we've been in, whether you've realized it or not. They've been hammering away at Sabbath observance. And that shouldn't come as any surprise, because Leviticus is focused on what? Their covenant approach to God's presence in the tabernacle. I mean, the whole first part of the book is all about that. Here's how you're going to approach me. My presence is there in the tabernacle. If you're to draw near to me, here's how you're to do it. And so when we look back at chapter 23, chapter 24, now we're in chapter 25, there is an emphasis, a pronounced emphasis upon Sabbath observance. In chapter 23, we uncovered the feasts of Israel, the appointed times where God plans to accomplish his redemption through the Messiah, those feast days. And every single one of those feast days is an additional solemn day of rest. There are additional Sabbaths that Israel had to observe. And they were God's means of, here's how I'm going to accomplish redemption. In fact, they all stem out of the weekly Sabbath observance. And when you look back at chapter 23, the weekly Sabbath is spelled out for us first, and then all of the feast days are spelled on out. And you'll recall, the feast of the Lord, they begin with Passover, the spring feast, starting with Passover, and we discovered how Jesus is our true and better Passover. He died to set us free from our bondage so that we could be set right with God and enjoy fellowship with him. He's our true and better unleavened bread. He's our true and better feast of first fruits. He's our true and better Pentecost. And we've seen how the fall feasts, they are a picture, they are foreshadowing what Jesus will do in his second coming. And how there is going to be national repentance for Israel. Christ is going to return. He'll return on the Day of Atonement. And then, once he returns, God's presence in Christ, the resurrected Messiah, will dwell in all of his glory in the promised land with God's people. It culminates to this day where God will tabernacle amongst his people once again. So there's all these solemn days of rest, extra solemn days of rest. Then we move to chapter 24, and chapter 24 focused in upon God's ultimate picture of rest in the tabernacle, right? There's the table of showbread with the 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and they were set before the golden lampstand there in the tabernacle. And that golden lampstand, if you were with us last week, then you'll recall that the golden lampstand was shaped and formed to look like a tree or a bush that was on fire and not consumed. And it was a reminder of how God appeared and revealed himself to Moses there on Mount Sinai. And so it's a picture of God's people basking in an undefiled, completely pure state before the presence of God himself. So there's a picture of complete rest there in chapter 24. And now we move on to Leviticus chapter 25, and we're focused in again on Sabbath, a Sabbath year, and the Sabbath of Sabbaths, the Jubilee. Now, when we group our years together, we tend to think in multiples of 10, right? Decades. Think of the 80s or the 90s. But the Jewish people, they group their years together not by decades, but by heptads, by groups of 7, just like the days of the week. We observe a heptad of days just by the week, but then when it comes to the years, we're like, no, we'll go decades, groups of 10. The Jewish people don't do that. They have weeks of days, and they have weeks of years. And every 7th year, the land was to receive a year of rest. It is as if the land itself receives a break from the curse of sin, the toil and the labor and everything that has been introduced because of sin. It receives a break from all of that. And the Sabbath year was to cause Israel to recognize that even though the promised land was given to them, and they were the ones to rightly take dominion over the land, at the end of the day, all of the land still ultimately belonged to God. And they were just stewards over the land for him, his representative, his dominion representatives. Just like Adam and Eve in the garden. God created the earth, the heavens and the earth, and all that are in. They belong to God. But then he sets Adam and Eve as kings and priests over his creation. They're able to rule and steward the land on his behalf. And so it's theirs. They know, hey, this doesn't, he put us in charge, but it doesn't ultimately belong to us. It belongs to him. And so all that they were to do was to be for his glory, and the provision they received from the land is always to be thought of, this is a gift from God. Verse 23, and the land shall not be sold permanently, right? For the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. The land belongs to the Lord. And God promised that if Israel observed the Sabbath year, that he would provide more than enough for them. Not only would they be able to eat from the fruit that just grew during the Sabbath year, but God specifically says in verses 18 through 22 that he would supernaturally cause a bump year, as it were, in the 6th year. The year before the Sabbath year, I'm going to cause there to just be a tremendous increase in the abundance of fruit, the abundance of harvest that you'll bring in. Look at verse 18 of Leviticus 25. So you shall observe my statutes and keep my judgments and perform them, and you will dwell in the land in safety, and then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and dwell there in safety. And if you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year, since we shall not sow nor gather in our produce, then I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year. And it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years. And you shall sow in the 8th year, and eat old produce until the 9th year. Until its produce comes in, you shall eat of the old harvest. That is phenomenal. I mean, what a phenomenal promise of blessing and provision on God's part. He's saying, don't worry about it. Trust me. Enjoy me. Enter into the rest that I ultimately want to provide you, that I've given you in this covenant relationship with you. Just trust me and I'll take care of everything else. And yet, Israel refused to obey. That is a glorious promise that Israel refused to obey. They refused to trust because when it comes right down to it, brothers and sisters, Israel has trust issues just like you and I have trust issues. It's easy to say, oh, don't worry, right? God will provide. You know, it's like Jehovah Jireh means God is my provider. A lot of times, oh, Jehovah Jireh, he's going to provide. He'll take care of it. Don't worry. Well, it's easy to say that, but it's an altogether different thing to live your life and order it in light of that reality. Saying, you know what? God is my provider. Things seem crazy right now, but he will meet me where I'm at. I don't need to freak out about it. He will take care of me. That's precisely what Jesus asked his disciples today to do as well. Matthew chapter 6, verse 25. Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food? Body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns. Isn't that interesting? Sabbath year, it's like, don't sow, don't reap, don't do whatever. God takes care of them. Yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? Which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature? So why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil.
Thank you, man. God bless you too. Morgan. End attack phase. End turn.
Toil nor spin, and yet I say to you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Now if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is thrown in the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Therefore,
Well, he could have killed
saying,
me
what
so
shall
long
we eat,
ago.
or what shall we
He
drink,
must
or
not be
what shall
that
we
good.
wear? For after all these things the Gentiles seek, they're consumed with those things. For your heavenly Father knows
that you need
all
them.
these things. But here's what you can do. Instead of worrying and fretting about all that stuff, because you have a Father in heaven who loves you and cares for you, has promised to provide for you, here's what you can do. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. All these things will be added to you. Prioritize and order your life in light of that reality. You have a Father who loves you and cares for you. Wants nothing more than for you to draw near to him, to seek him and pursue his eternal purposes. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Lord, help me to apply that in my own life. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble, right? It is. We got enough trouble today to worry about.
This guy does not know how to kill.
Now, that doesn't mean that we don't take right plan and forethought to plan for the future. But there is a boundary we cross when it comes to healthy concern and planning and counting the cost of things, to crossing over to utter worry and fretting and concern. And all too often we cross that boundary, and God's saying, don't do that. You don't need to do that. Or something comes up and we're like, I don't even know how we're going to make it. I don't even know how we're going to make it this month. I can't believe groceries are so out of control.
Oh, he was a master?
How are we even going to survive?
How is he a master? That the way that he killed was so weird for a master.
Choking out what the real priority needs to be in our life, which is drawing near to God and enjoying him, enjoying the rest that Jesus has provided us in his presence. And God's saying, you know what? You don't have to. I've taken care of things in such a way that you can be freed up. Scrap all of that worry, and now you got more time to spend with me, and I'll take care of that. And it's harder and harder to do as an adult. When it was a kid, you know, when it comes to worrying about money. When I was a kid, I didn't worry about money. You know why? Because I had parents who loved me and took care of it. They just did. I didn't. I did not worry. I didn't worry about where my food was coming from. I didn't worry about whether or not it was going to be taken care of. I had no worries about, like, what, am I going to have clothes? Are we even going to make it? I just had a childlike faith in my parents that they got this. But you know what? I found out years later that when we moved from Indianapolis to New Mexico, it was some hard times for my parents. I didn't know it. They just took care of it. And the reality is, brothers and sisters, we have a Father in heaven who has all resources at his disposal, a love and a care for us that far surpasses our fallen parents, and he says, I got this.
Yep.
Just trust me. I'll take care of all the troubles and the real needs that you have.
So you're gonna get out of my
will be met.
Bonus?
They'll be met. You don't need to worry about it. Additionally, Israel's failure to observe the Sabbath year and the Jubilee, it reveals that Israel was all too attached to this world. They were too enamored with comfort and the delights that they could milk out of this life instead of the comforts and the delights that are to come in the life to come. The comfort and delight that is available to them and to us in the very presence of God himself. And they did not prioritize their lives in light of God's ultimate Sabbath aim for all humanity, a restored and completed rest once again in the fullness of his presence. They began to go, no, I'm going to be satisfied over here. We can run after these. This is what's really going to complete and satisfy me. And if I just have more of this stuff, that's really where it's going to be at. And God's going, no, you know what? Rest in my presence. That is where it's at. And I would imagine that Israel did receive a bump year of crops on the 6th year before the 7th year, the sabbatical year that they failed to observe and honor and glorify God. Imagine that, right? There they are in the 6th year in the promised land, and boom, the crops are like, no way. We're like raking in 3 times the amount. This is just amazing. Oh, the provision is coming in. Oh, we're going to have it so good, and we could just kick back and take it easy. And man, if we get more and more of this stuff, maybe we can get rich or do whatever. And it should have served as a reminder, one, that God is their provider. All of this is coming from him, and he wants them to spend time with him. That they would order their lives and prioritize their lives in such a way that they would seek to honor the Sabbath and draw near to him and just worship him and glorify him. And yet they're so consumed with just getting more and getting ahead in this life that they're like, we got to go and plant this year. We're going to plant more. I can't just be content with where I'm at and the provision that God's brought into my life. I need to get more. And if I get more, then that's what's ultimately going to satisfy me. And brothers and sisters, let me just share with you. I have watched men and women derail their walk with God based upon big bonuses or promotions that they can just receive at work. Now, I am not saying, let me be very careful here. I am not saying that every bonus and promotion is not from the Lord. There could be bonuses and promotions that are from the Lord, and God could see fit to increase your pay. He very well can do that. But I have seen men and women give into promotion at work, a promotion that comes with, this is going to mean that you got to give up Sundays, more time with your family. You're not going to be able to make it to the Bible studies like you used to. You're not going to be able to spend time in God's Word like you used to. And it chokes out all of that stuff. And you know what? They made more money, but in the end, they were derailed. I mean, it was just not a good thing at all. And so we just need to be very cautious there and say, God, is that a promotion that's worth it? Is planting the 7th year again and doing that, is that worth it? No way. Or is going deeper with the Lord, being more intimate with him, is that where it's at? That's how we want to prioritize our life. They got greedy, so they plowed and they sowed the next year. Unfortunately, security and delight in this life trumped security and delight in the Lord and in the life to come. And so Israel failed to order all things in the strength and in the provision that they had received from the Lord. Say, God, every strength I have, everything I have is from you. I want to order all that I have in light of your goodness, your provision, and just being able to enjoy you. In fact, Philippians 4:13, very popular verse and often misquoted verse. I know I've shared this with you guys before. It's worth sharing again. You can know the verse. I can do all things through Christ, who strengthens me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my wife has brought, I don't have it yet, but my wife showed me this coffee mug, and I need to get my hands on it. But on this coffee mug, it said, I can do all things through this verse taken out of context. And I was like, that is how a lot of people use Philippians 4:13. But I want you to see that this verse, its direct context in Philippians chapter 4 is financial contentment. It's contentment before the Lord. So Philippians chapter 4, we'll start in verse 10. And then we'll read through to verse 14. Just look at the context. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last your care for me has flourished again. Though you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. So he's saying, hey, I know you, church in Philippi, you sent me financial aid to help me along in my mission as an apostle. And I'm thankful for that. But I'm not speaking because I'm trying to milk more money out of you. As I've learned, whatever state I'm in, to be content. Verse 12, I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Nevertheless, you have done well that you have shared in my distress. It has to do with contentment. The all things that Paul is specifically talking about is utter contentment before the Lord and in his provision. And oftentimes when we abound or when we're abased, it's a test of, can we be content with the Lord? And when things and resources are stripped away, it does cause us to be more dependent upon the Lord. When God sees fit at times to bless his children with more, he gives them an abundance. Guess what? That's a test too. Can you be content with it? Can you order that provision in a way? So God, you know what? Chiefly what I want is you. Help me to order everything I have, all my time, all my resources, everything in a way that prioritizes you, enjoying you, and the life to come. Help me to do that. But all too often, we can fail on that end, and it's like, whoa, we just spend it in all kinds of weird ways. Brothers and sisters, with all of this talk about Sabbath and its importance, how are we to keep and honor the Sabbath, right? After all, if it's part of the 10 Commandments, then how do we keep from violating it, right? Are we to every Saturday just not work, make sure we don't pick up any sticks, because that's really what it's about? No. It's about remembering what the Sabbath is really all about and the one who is actually able to accomplish Sabbath rest for us. The Sabbath day, honoring the Sabbath day, is just a shadow, an outline that is meant to point us to the one who can truly accomplish Sabbath for us. The substance of the Sabbath is in Christ. Jesus,
why would you do
the
that?
Sabbath, came to earth to secure for us ultimate Sabbath rest. The veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom. The very presence of the living God dwells inside of us because of what Christ has done. We are established and at peace and at rest with God because of what Christ has done. And we will enter into glory. One day we will live in a fully redeemed universe where there is no more sin, no more suffering, no more shame. Everything will be completely renewed, and we will behold God with our own eyes face to face because of what Christ has done. He came to live the life that you and I could not live and pay the price for our Sabbath disrupting sin, which we could never pay. And just as a little clue here, every Sabbath year, if you were a Hebrew slave, you were set free. you were set free. What a beautiful, glorious reality. And we'll see in the year of Jubilee, more restoration happen. You're restored back to your line. Everything was made new. All of that is possible, brothers and sisters.
Aw,
because
you
of what Christ has
douche.
done.
Is he gonna break
He
me?
paid the price that we could never pay so that we might enjoy unhindered peace and rest in God's presence once again. And now that Jesus has
Oh, he's
arrived,
gonna
there is
kill
no longer
Blue. Fuck. Bro, Blue fucked me. That sucks so much that Blue did that. Like, why would they have done that? Just out of nowhere. Fuck you, Blue. That was so annoying.
keep the Sabbath because Jesus is the fulfillment and the substance of the redemptive work that God announced all the way back in the garden. So if you have Jesus, you have the substance of the Sabbath and everything that the Sabbath intends to point
Purple
us
and blue
to.
sucked.
In Colossians chapter 2, verse 13, and you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross, having disarmed principalities and powers. He made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. So let no one judge you in food or drink. Look, if you have Christ, all of the dietary laws were intended to point you to Jesus. Or regarding a festival or a new moon.
Beginner.
All of the feast of the Lord, all of those observances, those are intended to point you to Christ too. Don't let anyone judge you regarding festival or new moon or Sabbaths. Not any Sabbath, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. Jesus is our Sabbath rest. He's the substance. Brothers and sisters, my family's out of town here this week. They're driving on their way home, even as we speak. They're out of town, and when they get here, I go on walks with them, and I know what their shadows look like. And when my wife gets here, I tell you what, she hops out, and I could see her shadow on the ground, and I would know that that's her. But when she gets here, I am not going to run and go grab her shadow. I'm going to run and grab her. I'm going to embrace her. I want to embrace the substance, not the shadow. So we don't need to run back to just taking a day off or taking a year off. What we need to do is run to Jesus, the one who truly allows us to be redeemed back into a place of complete rest before the Lord God Almighty. Would you pray with me this morning? Lord, we thank you. And as we get ready to celebrate communion today, we want to be mindful of what it is that Jesus has accomplished. We want to be mindful of the substance over the shadow. And God's Sabbath is important. It's important to you and it's important to us. And it's so important to us that we want to run to Jesus and embrace him with everything that we have. Thank you.
I do not
that you
see
have
a
not left
route.
creation to be undone for all eternity. Thank you that you have not let us to be undone for all eternity, but you've provided a means of reconciliation and restoration in your Son. In Jesus' name, amen.
This case is never going to be solved. We need some answers.
Art movement, with most of the early painters being CIA agents, and the art
Oh, what the heck?
In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your...
Biden embarrasses himself. When doesn't Biden embarrass himself? All right, here we go.
Tim Sheehy is a conservative outsider, ready to lead, secure our border, fight inflation.
Based.
Many of my Republican friends want to put Social Security and Medicare back on the chopping block again. If anyone tries to cut Social Security, Medicare, or raise retirement age again, I will stop them. Working people built this country. They pay more into Social Security than millionaires and billionaires do. It's not fair. Folks, we have two ways to go at Social Security and Medicare. Republicans will cut Social Security and Medicare to give us more tax cuts for the wealthy. Even this morning, Donald Trump said cuts to Social Security and Medicare on the table again. When asked if he changed his position, he said, quote, "There's a lot you can do in terms of cutting. Tremendous amount of things you can cut." Maybe it's a second. Tremendous amount of things you can do, not cut. He said, I will, and the bottom line is, he's still at it. I'm never going to allow that to happen. They won't cut Social Security, they won't cut Medicare. Instead,
I mean, it's failing anyways, so why not?
Medicare, give tax breaks to the
I don't have a Social Security number, so I can't get any of these benefits anyway, so I don't give a shit.
wealthy. I will protect and strengthen Social Security and Medicare.
Also, it's gonna fail before I become a fucking before I'm able to.
Preserve Medicare benefits in this Medicare trust fund. Because Maggie's leadership, because of it, I'm also cracking down on surprise medical.
President Biden ramping up his re-election campaign tonight, attacking Donald Trump.
All right.
Biden warns Netanyahu an assault on Rafah would cross red line. More than 1 million Palestinians have taken refuge in city, which is Israel's next target in war against Hamas. And then 1 hour later, Netanyahu vows to defy Biden's red line and invade Rafah. Oh, well, there you go. You know, asked and answered. You know, people criticize Netanyahu, but really he's the only politician giving us these, like, direct, consistent, straightforward answers to the questions we have, which is, do you want to commit genocide? And his answer, obviously, is a resounding yes. You know, from Biden, we just get this waffling, but from Netanyahu, you know, he's committed to the bit. At least he's honest about this thing and this thing alone. You know, he lies all the time. He's just securing the southern border of the Gaza Strip, you know? Relief organizations have warned that an attack in Rafah on the border with Egypt and now refuge for about half of Gaza's 2.3 million population will result in widespread civilian casualties. Germany's foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, said it would be a humanitarian catastrophe. Dude, if even German politicians are willing to criticize Israel, that's when you know nobody is on board. Germany is so... because their government is terrified of the criticism
of being a Nazi
from Zionists if they criticize Israel in any way, shape, or form. But even they are willing to say, you know, it would be a humanitarian catastrophe. That's so cool. Without naming them, Netanyahu claimed he had the tacit support of several Arab leaders for driving ahead with the onslaught against Hamas. Did you go over Biden's hot mic moment where he said he will have a come-to-Jesus conversation with Netanyahu?
Close your eyes. Just breathe. Reach out with your senses. What do you smell? A new soap. The Dr. Squatch Star Wars Collection 2. 4 new limited
I'm gonna kill
bar
Green.
soaps inspired by masters
He pissed
and
me
apprentices
off.
on the light side and the dark. Made with natural, nourishing ingredients
Yep,
that put
Green's
your fate
dead.
in your hands. Follow the scent. Master, why have you gone into exile? Exile? No, young one. I was just showering. Teach me. Want to become the master of your shower? The sudsy satisfaction of legendary lather will help you leave a lasting legacy. Or rise up with the light exfoliation of resistance rinse. Reach out with your senses. Let the soap flow over you.
Bright and refreshing. Breezy and grassy. Musky and steamy. Rich and spicy.
Yes, give in to the suds.
What the fuck?
It's not really a hot mic moment. Like, he knows the mic is hot.
Yeah, I could barely hear this audio. I saw, like, Ted Cruz was all pissed off about this. And I was like, what's the big deal, dog? Who gives a shit? Oh my goodness, he doesn't want...
I was telling your secretary, you know, I was in Jordan and Israel this weekend.
But does Netanyahu believe in Jesus? I mean, Jews
No.
believe in Christ. Christ was a Jew.
They don't believe in Jesus. They think that he was a Oh, you douche. Do not. Oh, okay. Phew. All right.
You gotta keep pushing what you're doing on the humanitarian stuff and all this shit. So,
I told him, baby, don't repeat this.
Don't repeat this.
Sure, just
What did he say right there? I gotta read that. I told him, baby, don't repeat this.
Don't repeat.
Because he's afraid of what would happen.
Sure, just. That was good.
Oh, did he genuinely think that there wasn't a mic present there? There's no way. There's no way somebody who's been doing politics for 50 years would genuinely think that with a camera pointed at your face like this, there's no way. He had to have known. He had to have known, and when they said, sir, you're being
What
recorded,
a piece
he
of
was like,
shit.
oh, okay, haha. It had to be intentional. I don't think that Netanyahu's gonna have a come to Jesus moment, guys. I don't know. I don't think it's gonna happen. Judaism doesn't recognize Jesus as ever existing. That's Islam. Only in the U.S. do some Jews think that. Only in the U.S.? Really? Jews broadly don't believe in the existence of Christ. I know they don't think he's the Messiah, but whatever. Doesn't matter. I don't think Netanyahu was genuinely motivated by any sincere Jewish belief or whatever, so it doesn't matter. Netanyahu claimed the sea convoy as his idea in the interview and denied people were starving. Okay, yeah. So this basically confirms it. If Netanyahu actually was the one who came up with the idea of America building a dock in the Gaza Strip, he would have announced it first. The fact that he's now claiming it was his idea means he didn't want Biden to go through with it, and he's trying to lay claim to it now because he doesn't want to seem weak, because he can't actually stop the U.S. from doing whatever they want. Yeah, okay, so that confirms that. So the fact that he would then immediately say, like, yeah, no, we are going to invade Rafah, kind of makes it seem likely then that this is some...
What a dumb fuck, that guy who did that. Like, why? Why would you do that? Just put yourself in a shittier position? What?
Kind of reprisal, or that he's acting
And waste
spitefully.
so many troops on it?
I'm working on this new case. A missing scientist. Frozen solid?
I've seen that before. Years ago. The Night Country. It takes us one by one.
All your favorite brands are now at Petco.
The fighting could end in as little as a month. We've destroyed 3/4 of Hamas's fighting terrorism battalions, and we're close to finish them. I know you can find the footage out there, but it really is crazy how little evidence there is of the IDF fighting Hamas. Like, at all. I know you can find video footage of, like, people taking shots at one another from opposite ends of a bunch of rubble, but so much of the battle footage that came out of you know, out of Ukraine was just, like, so objectively evidentiary of the conflict, whereas the only stuff you see out of the Gaza Strip is just civilian buildings getting demolished and civilians being killed and, you know, armless children being pulled out of rubble. There's a lot of footage of them killing innocent, deaf old people and finding pristine, well-charged iPads with Adolf Hitler as the lock screen. So that's a good sign with the doc, right, Vosh, that Netanyahu seems to be acquiescing? Well, if anything, it's an indication that Netanyahu would acquiesce to anything the United States did. Because as much as Netanyahu talks a big game, we're the United States. If Netanyahu doesn't want a Gaza Strip dock, but we just do it anyway, maybe there are a bunch of other things we could do that he would have no choice but to go along with, you know? Maybe we're maybe, just engage in this hypothetical with me. Maybe we're the global superpower. Possibly. It might be true That's Russia, Vosh. True. Yeah. The real superpower. Still, Netanyahu was careful in his criticism of his American counterpoint and even more circumspect when asked whether he would prefer Republican candidate Donald Trump. The last thing I want to do is enter the American political arena, he said. See, Netanyahu wants Trump because lunatic fascists like lunatic fascists. It's not subtle. But he also knows that if he publicly supported Trump, it would immediately ostracize literally tens of millions of American Zionist liberals, because there are a lot of dumbass American liberals who are voting for Biden and who think that, like, Israel is the Middle East's only democracy and they're like the pro-gay rights bastion of the Middle East and so on. So if Netanyahu just flatly stated, you know, Donald Trump is better than Joe Biden, it would only serve to his detriment.
Fuck
the
that
artifice
guy.
of bipartisan support
Red's gonna win, but
is very much like something he's trying to take advantage of. Domestic support plummeting. On the vexed question of whether Israel would need to expand its campaign to combat Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, he left open the prospect of a military operation in order to facilitate the return of people who have left their homes in northern Israel through fear of cross-border attacks by the Shiite militia groups. Let's do it. Let's do it, boys. Are you ready? Are you ready for the invasion of Lebanon? Let's go. Honestly, with how mishandled the IDF has been over the past few, over the course of the conflict, it makes me wonder how well they'd even hold up against Hezbollah in spite of having significantly more people and better weapons. Oh wait, actually, how big is the IDF? They have more people than Hezbollah. IDF population. Yeah, 1.5 million men. They conscript. They conscript. They have a more populous country. Yeah. 1.5 million males, 1.4 million females. They could bring as many people on board as they wanted to. Hezbollah isn't a Hamas type army. No, Hezbollah is a proper military, you know? I mean, not proper military the way that, like, the IDF is, but far more so than Hamas. Massively more. I wonder how much more popularity Netanyahu would lose with a draft. No. I don't know how well that would go considering Lebanon is UN recognized, and the Lebanese government doesn't actually like
I basically
Hezbollah.
had
At
to
least
take
on paper, it's complicated. I didn't know Hezbollah
yeah,
had that
because
many
he was a
fans.
novice.
Well, you know, get along with Iran at least. Lebanon is more populous, but yeah. Wait, does Lebanon have more people in it than Israel? Is that true? Population 5.6 million. No, that's less than Israel. 5.6 million. I think Israel, yeah, Israel's more than that. Population for Israel's 9.3. They're both so small. Dude, like, we're literally talking about countries that have less people and less land than American states. It's so... Lebanon is fragmented hard, though. Yeah, to be...
Yeah, no, I think that this is stupid what conservatives, I don't even think that they are real conservatives, are saying that Sydney Sweeney has ended wokeness. Hold on. I've got to go to the bathroom real quick. I'll be right back. Oh.
Why so serious?
Sorry.
We're out there filming for a...
Here. We're going to watch this interview. Or debate, I guess.
Michael Knowles, welcome to Within Reason.
Alex, thank you for having me.
We have unfinished business, I think. The last time I saw you will have been in this cigar bar in Nashville. We were out there filming for a Catholic Mass, a traditional Latin Mass organization, and I was something of the token or resident atheist. I say that, I mean, they treated me very well, and I had a very good time filming this project, but I think I might have been the only atheist in the room, and so the conversation at dinner was really interesting, in particular when we briefly got onto the subject of America as a Christian nation. I think we had about a few sentences each, and then swiftly moved on to other things. So I was hoping we could sort of pick that back up again, but do so in the fine company of my podcast audience.
I was hoping that the unfinished business would be the scotch and the cigars, but I suppose the conversation is fine enough. So yes, that's a very important question, because I know you've been traveling around the States, but in recent months, this notion of Christian nationalism, this grand debate over the religious origins of America, has become the hobby horse of the left. I think that the Democrats think this will be one of their best chances to really beat Trump in November. So it's come into prominence, and a lot of both sides are making lots of claims that seem dubious and only lightly related to historical reality, but it reminds one of the line of Ronald Reagan, you know, our opponents are not so much ignorant as they know so many things that aren't so. And in America, to quote a fellow British atheist, Christopher Hitchens, he observed that Americans just never read history ever. So unfortunately, the consequence of that is that people don't know even our own founding history.
Having said that, that's the self-same Christopher Hitchens who would have not so much died, but probably won on the hill of arguing that America was in no way a Christian nation. Whether or not he was correct is another question. Whether he would have won the argument, I think, is undeniable, depending on who it was he was talking to. That's another thing that we had in common, our shared suspicion of Christopher Hitchens as a philosophical thinker, although I think I'm a little more charitable towards him in terms of his overall influence over my thinking than you would be. But I think there are two ways of approaching this question. As you say, recently we have a conversation that takes let's say, a more political tone. That is, this description of Christian nationalism as a sort of right-wing danger to the fabric of America, in the way that a lot of right-wingers will see left-wing radical wokists as a danger to the fabric of America. And so the focus is, I suppose, maybe more on the nationalism part than the Christian part. But there's also just this historical question, which is the one that I'm more interested in, which is less about, let's say, the danger of people who today believe in the existence of God and the risks that they might pose to American democracy, whatever that might mean, but whether the country that you're in is best described in a historical sense as a Christian nation. And I've heard you say before that it is, and I've heard you use phrases like the soul of America is Christian, and saying things like this. And I suppose the first thing I wanted to clarify is, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you do say that America is a Christian nation, or perhaps ought to be a Christian nation, are you talking here legally, like in terms of the documents, the Constitution, or are you just talking about the culture or something like that, or the philosophy undergirding the legal element of this conversation?
I don't always neatly separate these two things. I know that some American libertarians are fond of saying that, politics is totally distinct from culture or something like that. I think that's all a little bit silly. I think what we're talking about here when we talk about the soul of a country is a nation's constitution, capital C, and a nation's constitution, lowercase c. And that laws and customs and taboos and ends and goals are not so neatly separable. So another problem, I suppose, with Americans being a little dismissive of history is that we pick arbitrary dates to start looking at our own history. So typically, Americans look at 1776, or else, a little over a decade later at the Constitutional Convention, and they will say, this is the beginning of America. But it does cause one to ask, well, hold on, where did those people come from? How did they get there? And so America begins a little earlier than that. I would trace it to 1620, to the Mayflower. One could, I suppose, trace it in different parts even earlier than that. But in any case, wherever you trace it to, the men who came there broadly were Christian. They certainly came from a Christian culture. And where Americans have long found their origin is in the Mayflower, among men who were extraordinarily zealous separatist Christians. In fact, you know, I'm not an academic historian or even a trained apologist or theologian. I am a cigar salesman, and I've named my cigar company Mayflower after those very men. Some of my ancestors were on that boat, and they made it quite clear that they were in the United States on a religious project, the country that would become the United States, on a religious project. And then the Puritans who followed the Pilgrims were had slight distinctions from them theologically, but were broadly the same. And so Governor John Winthrop of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he declared that America would be a shining city on a hill in a famous speech called A Model of Christian Charity. And all the way up through the Revolution, Americans considered themselves to be Christian. The Founding Fathers were a little bit of a hodgepodge of Freemasons and deists, but there were a number of vaguely faithful seeming Christians among them, and even the ones who were not particularly orthodox in their Christianity, at least recognize the importance of Christianity to the country. So you have a founding father, author of the Federalist Papers, and the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay. He said that Christianity must be the religion of the United States. He thanked God that the country had the same religion, were descended from the same stock. He went so far as to say that non-Christians should never hold public office. Now, there's no religious test for office in the Constitution, but there are religious parameters around the country. So if you go back to the philosophical founding document, the Declaration, it begins and predicates the nation on the notion that all men are created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. So I'm not trying to convince you here that this is a papal bull or this is, some particularly sectarian version of Christianity. But at the very least, the nation, I think we all would have to agree, is predicated on the notion that God exists and created us and gave us rights. And then in practice, America developed far more clearly in a Christian manner, so much so that in our national anthem, in the little heard final verse, the final stanza, Francis Scott Key writes, "Conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, and God is our trust," and it's inscribed on our money, and it's in our Pledge of Allegiance. So, I think one can quibble over quite how orthodox or rigorous the Christianity of America was, but it's simply an historical fact that it was Christian men who were motivated by Christian ideas, who created Christian institutions, who founded the country, whether it was consciously Christian or not.
And quibble we shall. We'll get back to Michael Knowles in just a moment, but first, I've got an exciting announcement. I want to invite you to join me and others in person for 2 days of discussions and debate, all happening at the inaugural Dissident Dialogues of 2024. It's taking place in Brooklyn, New York on the 3rd and 4th of May 2024, and as well as me, will feature the likes of Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Chris Williamson, Konstantin Kisin, Francis Foster, and more. Dissident Dialogues is an opportunity to join the conversation with influential thinkers where everyone, conservatives, progressives, religious, atheist, left, right, and everything else, is welcome. We'll be tackling the important topics like religion, science, politics, and culture. So if these sound up your street, Dissident Dialogues is the place for you. Buy your tickets now at dissidentdialogues.org and be a part of the conversation. Now back to Michael Knowles. I think it's probably worth beginning, and by the way, I'm talking here about the United States of America, and I understand that it's useful to look historically at what precedes a nation to understand what that nation becomes, but we have quite good insights into the writings, the private thoughts even from their letters and things of the founders of the country that we now see today. So I think one of the most underrated, let's say, even though he is quite highly rated, of the founding fathers is of course Thomas Paine, without whom the revolution may not have taken place. I mean, it's often said that Thomas Paine is the author of the revolution, and this is because he writes Common Sense, which It's during a time when many people in the colonies were really just looking for better representation. The idea of actual revolution and independence was not as inevitable as a lot of people may think. Thomas Paine writes Common Sense and convinces a lot of people that actually maybe independence is the goal here. And I think to this day, Common Sense is still the greatest selling American pamphlet now, and it's still in print, of course. He's not just the author of the American Revolution, though, of course. He's also the author of a text known as The Age of Reason, which espouses, sure, a philosophical deism. He says in no uncertain terms right at the beginning that he believes in one God, but also describes organized religions, including Christianity, as essentially conspiracies to conduct power and to hold monopolies over people. And in fact, this leads him into a great deal of controversy. He ends up narrowly escaping execution. He gets exiled, he dies, and then when his bones are dug up to be brought back over to England, they end up getting lost, and we still don't know where his bones are today, and about 6 people attended his funeral. And yet this man is the author of the American Revolution. Now, why is it that at the end of his life he's treated with such disregard and contempt? It might have something to do with the fact that his own personal religious beliefs were, in no uncertain terms, not Christian. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that America is a legally secular nation. It doesn't mean that Thomas Paine is not an anomaly among the Founding Fathers. But in the way that we can say, okay, the founding document of America, maybe the Declaration of Independence, not a legal document. I mean, the Declaration of Independence is not supposed to be legislation. It doesn't protect any rights. It doesn't establish any courts. It doesn't do anything other than act as a polemic, essentially, against not just monarchy, but the specific king.
Well,
and so
just on that point, I mean, I'm
sure.
Quite interested in many of the things you've said, and I'm not surprised that a British atheist would choose a Brit, a very liberal Brit,
mention Thomas
as
Paine,
his favorite founding father. But you know, there was some legal force to the Declaration, which is that the Declaration told King George that they were separating. So I agree with you. It's a different sort of document than the Constitution. Though Abraham Lincoln later then in the 19th century elevates, again, the Declaration of Independence to the level of, I think, a more significant founding document.
Shit.
But it does have some legal bearing in as much as it kicked the whole thing off.
Quite scandalous.
Yes, I will.
I need a fire breather.
Hot mama.
Can you knock on the table for us?
Bro, why is blue so bad? They're just screwing our game here. Like, they could attack.
Yeah, it's treasonous. I mean, there's literally treasonous in the sense that if I write a document right now that says something illegal, which can happen in the United Kingdom, this would have sort of legal relevance, let's say. But the Declaration is clearly supposed to be a mixture of. It's supposed to draw upon law and history and also rhetoric. It's supposed to uplift and inspire a nation to revolution, which is sort of what it did and what it does. But when you get to the actual legal document, it takes a little bit more time and a few more people to throw together. Interestingly, by the way, one of Thomas Jefferson's earliest drafts of the Declaration of Independence doesn't mention a creator. It does say that that men and women are endowed by that they are created equal, but it doesn't say that they're endowed by a creator. It's only sort of Congress in later editing that document that gets added in. But look, I'll grant it to you. Fine, the Declaration of Independence has a creator. It's still not Christian, by the way. And of course, if a Christian writes the creator, they're probably talking about the Christian creator. But the whole point of America and the reason that the founders were so genius is because they recognized that not everybody living in the country and not everybody who goes on to rule the country are going to share their political opinions. And so they were very clear about what kind of political views and what kind of political tests somebody must pass and which ones must not be relevant. And we know that religious belief is not one of those, especially when we look at the Constitution and find that the only times religion is mentioned is twice.
Bro, don't
Firstly,
pick blue!
in saying that no religious test, that there should be no religious test to any public office in the United States. And secondly, in the later added Bill of Rights, protecting the free exercise of religion. And so I suppose what I'm asking is, when we look at the actual
Why do games keep
legal
going like
texts
this?
here, I understand the idea that referring to a creator in the Declaration of Independence, maybe Congress had the Christian God in mind. Maybe they didn't. I mean, some of these founders were, as you say. I mean, you said it was a hodgepodge. That's putting it lightly. Thomas Jefferson famously cuts out all references to the divinity of Christ from his Gospels. Like, where are we getting this specifically Christian idea at the founding of America from, and not just some kind of vague deism that may have even only been referenced in the first place in a rhetorical attempt to inspire people to revolution?
Well, I totally grant that Thomas Jefferson had some problems. I'm not denying it. I mean, Thomas Jefferson was one of, if not the most liberal of the founding fathers. And then you mention Thomas Paine, who I wouldn't count really as a founding father, but he did write the pamphlet that kicked off a lot of revolutionary
Yes,
sentiment.
Wikipedia would disagree with you there.
Listen, you
gonna be
limeys,
so
I don't know
bad.
what you're doing to our founding fathers, but that man I consider separate. But he's obviously is extremely important, and he was quite radical. You know, if we're picking our favorite Brits who were in favor of America in one way or the other, I would have to side with the great Edmund Burke, who took a great deal of issue with Thomas
Edmund
Paine, but
Burke.
perhaps we can get to him a little bit later. When it comes to
I actually am reading his book, rereading his book right now. It's actually got Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine in it. It has reflections in reflections on the Revolution in France and the Right of Men. So it's got both books about, one by Edmund Burke and one by Thomas Paine, about the French Revolution. So.
the Declaration, we don't need to wonder too much.
I haven't
about
read
what these
I haven't read the Rights of Men by Thomas Paine.
guys
but-
thought about the creator, because we do have some of their writings. And John Adams, who served in the Continental Congress and then was the second president and was a political foe of Thomas Jefferson, said, and the man, by the way, was not particularly orthodox in his Christianity, but he said that we all agreed that the general principles for the revolution on which we could achieve national independence would be the general principles of Christianity. So he speaks about Christianity broadly. He's speaking on behalf of his fellows in the Continental Congress and the Founding Fathers. Even as you say, if Jefferson didn't, he was a little reluctant to include the word creator. He ultimately acquiesced, and it's a document not just of single authorship by Jefferson, but it's a statement by this incipient country. So you see that there, but you see it elsewhere also. You see it in the Federalist Papers. Again, not exactly reading like an encyclical or a papal bull, but the Federalist Papers, specifically James Madison, do cite God directly by name. And then you have the Constitution. You mentioned the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, which says that there will be the free exercise of religion. There will be no establishment of a church. This is quite misunderstood in modern day, because some people take this to mean
it's about the Catholic Church because they were Protestant.
There can be no church established anywhere in the United States, or they go even further and say that the country would be secular. It'd be absent from religion, and this would have been completely unheard of to the framers of the Constitution. In fact, the chief political reason for the refusal to establish a church at the national level is that there already were churches established at the state level. There were a number of them, and they persisted for decades after the ratification of the Constitution. So no one would have understood that to be unconstitutional or contrary to the spirit of the new nation. If so, the Constitution never would have been ratified. Now, later on, again, bringing Lincoln back into it, in the middle of the 19th century, you get, or later 19th century, you get the 14th Amendment, which then incorporates the Bill of Rights to the states, and probably precludes any chance that we would have of having state establishments.
Why are you
ever
placing
again.
there?
But, now we're fast forwarding over 150 years. At least at the beginning of the country, it was not understood as having a firm separation of church and
Not
state,
what I
no
wanted.
matter what Thomas Jefferson might have longed for in a
But I
private
guess I
window.
can go boom.
Bring on the frozen tundra, the grinding gravel, the cratered concrete. Come on, road, do your worst. We'll be at our best. Duralast parts, designed to meet or exceed original equipment performance. Exclusively at AutoZone.
Yes, well, of course, that's often referred to, and I know we must be careful not to conflate the, let's say, private interpretations of the founders of what the Constitution said and what the Constitution either actually literally says or what it should perhaps be understood to say. I mean, the Establishment Clause doesn't just, it seems to me, preclude the ability to have an established church. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It seems much more broad than this, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It seems to be a protection both of private religious belief and also, or I should say, both a protection of private religious belief, but also a preclusion of the government to legislate in any way that respects an establishment of religion, not
but
just
again,
establishing some state church.
The key here, though, is the Congress part. Congress shall make no law, because it's very easy to look back with the current mode of jurisprudence and constitutional law and impose that on the Continental Congress, or I'm sorry, on the Constitutional Convention. But that was just not what the phrase meant at that time or for many decades afterward. Congress could make no law doing those things because the states could do that, and the states did that, and the states had plenty of religious laws. We had blasphemy laws on the books in the United States until very, very recently, and the churches did have established, or rather the states had established churches. So if we're talking about some protection of an individual right to believe whatever he wants, that's just not there. The Constitution was far more limited, and when we're talking about something like the First Amendment, what we're actually seeing here is a restriction on the right of the Congress to make these sorts of declarations.
So how about this then? The United States, at least at its founding, was at the federal level a secular nation.
I wouldn't say secular, really. I mean, I would say it did not have an established church, and I would say it did not take a sectarian side in things. The Founding Fathers and the Framers were all pretty focused on that. But I just don't think it would have meant very much to anyone, especially considering that we're talking about a federal system here. So, you can't just view the federal government absent the state governments or absent the rights of the people, for that matter. One of the ironies here, as we're debating the supposedly secular foundation of the country, is the best description I've ever seen of the American government, which came to the Founding Fathers either directly or implicitly through other thinkers, is the description of perfect government by St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologiae, which says that there will be not merely a monarchy, but there will be a monarchical element, a strong executive, and then an aristocratic element, and then a democratic element, representation for the people. And so in the American system, as it was founded, we've decayed a little bit since then, I'm sorry to say, that's exactly what you have. You have the thumotic element in the executive, which could have been a hereditary king, or at least an elected king. Alexander Hamilton argued to some degree for that. And then we have the aristocratic element, and then obviously there's a strong democratic element. But it confuses a lot of modern liberals, including Americans, because they say, we're a democracy and democracy is at stake and, whatever. Our buildings are temples of democracy. But obviously there's quite a lot to the American system that is not democratic, and it's because they were trying to balance all these different types of regime, as well as balance different types of power of the national government, which confusingly we call the federal government, even though federal refers to all of these different layers and protections for the states, and then obviously the state power, and then the individual rights as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I suppose I do want to talk about Thomas Jefferson and his wall of separation, but look, I mean, suppose that we were trying on this hypothesis that America is explicitly a secular nation, and that's what the founders intended. You might ask, okay, could the language not have been a bit clearer? Maybe. But I could ask the same question in the other direction, because really the question of whether America is a secular nation, I think, should best be framed as, is it a religious nation or not? If it's not, then what are we left with? And if the claim is that it's a Christian nation, I could ask similarly, what's with the complete and utter lack of any reference to God, let alone Christ or Christianity or anything of that sort in the Constitution? If the founders quite clearly, in their private letters, were saying to each other, yes, this is certainly Christian, which also I don't even think is true. I think that for every example you have of a founder talking about the Christian basis of America, you can find even sometimes the same founders saying the opposite. For example, famously, John Adams signs the Treaty of Tripoli, which says that the government of the United States is not in any way founded on the Christian religion. Now, you're probably going to want to say something like, now, I don't know, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but look, this is the Treaty of Tripoli, right? This is he's quite clearly just writing to some Muslims, trying to,
stop them from taking our sailors. Also negotiated
right.
by a Jeffersonian diplomat.
Quite right, indeed, as well. And so, okay, sure. In fact, why don't I avoid putting words in your mouth and tell me what you make of this Treaty of Tripoli, in which we have those words. I'll repeat them. I will underline them and underline them again. The government of the United States is in no way founded on the Christian religion. How do you explain that one?
Well, I explain it exactly as you just have, which is it's the Treaty of Tripoli, okay? And these Muslim pirates were stealing our sailors, and we wanted it to come to an end. And it's not even as though John Adams negotiated this directly. In fact, tellingly, I think it was negotiated by an acolyte of Jefferson, a Jeffersonian diplomat. And so, but all of that to say, I don't really dismiss your point. You're right that there was some confusion among the founding fathers, and they certainly didn't found the country as hierocratic or theocratic.
Hello? What?
You're gonna laugh at this. You're gonna kick out this. So I was at somewhere the other day with Auntie Deb, and this kid comes to our church. His name's Josh, and he is so funny, Jace. You would laugh at him so hard. So he has a Mustang like your brother has, and he was like, I was trying to start my car and I couldn't start it, and I didn't have my keys together, and he's like, I couldn't find my keys. I looked and looked, and I was like, yeah, a lot of people do that. Well, he's like,
or anything.
I come to your guys' church too, and I was like, what? And he comes up to me, Jace, gives me a huge hug, and he's like, are you gonna be church next week? And I was like, yeah, I will. And he's
nice.
like, he was like going off about you and us, and he's like, who's that tall dude? And I was like, you not know who he is? And so I put your name out, and I was like, his name is Jace.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like, what? That is so funny as heck. And so we're at the one at the dealerships, because Auntie Deb was looking at the vehicle,
Yeah.
And he's like, I just wanted to tell you, you're so funny. And I was like, good. I get kicked out of you for laughs.
Yeah.
And he laughed so hard, Jace. It's funny. He was giggling so hard, Jace. He wouldn't stop laughing.
Yeah.
Just keep laughing and laughing, and I was like trying to make him happy, that day, because he was having a bad day, And his day better, and I was like, I'll make your day better. Well,
Yeah.
I just laughing so hard, Jason was funny. You should have saw his face. You should have saw his face, what he looked like when he was looking at me. Oh?
All right. Gabs, I got to go. Okay?
Okay.
All right, I'll see you later. Yeah, we're going to church on Sunday.
Can we go to the earliest one, please?
Yeah, we'll go to the early one.
And I can see everybody.
Yeah.
All my friends. Get back to our schedule.
Yeah, we can.
We need to get our routine back together. Ready to get our routine, start it back up. Start doing what we were doing for a while.
Yeah.
It's like when we started our routine, and then, now it's gonna be easier now, because even Jay will get to have her routine too with us,
Yeah.
We won't be so tired. I just, I wanted to work day shifts instead of night,
What?
I said she should do day shifts.
No.
And night shifts instead.
Yeah. All right, Gabs, I gotta go, okay?
And then she's not so tired all the time.
Yeah, I gotta go, though, okay? I'll see you later.
I love you.
Love you
Bye.
too. Bye.
Good night.
Night. She's always making up stories.
Like that. Theocracy just being government by clerics. Certainly it isn't. Though I am skeptical of your suggestion that for every pro-Christian point that I could find in the Federalist Papers or the Declaration, or at least implicit in the Declaration, or in the private correspondence of John Adams or Madison, for that matter, that you could find another point on the other side. I agree. You can find a lot of confusing messages and even contradictions there, but I think the evidence is overwhelmingly on the side of Christianity in some form or another. So yes, you're right. The president signs a prudential treaty to preserve some of our sailors, and he tries to assuage the Muslims because he knows the only way to get them to stop is to say, we're not really a Christian nation, don't worry. But I think that that little treaty with those random little Muslim pirates taken against all of the other documents and the whole century and a half of American history that we've cited, it doesn't quite hold up. I think there are better arguments for secularism.
I think that little treaty, signed and directed towards that random little British king is also not particularly relevant here, especially given that you just said.
Hold on.
Christianity. You said
you're telling me that the Declaration of Independence and the Treaty of Tripoli are on equal standing and significance to American history? You don't believe that?
No, I don't believe that. What I do believe is that they're both equally relevant to the present conversation, because you said a moment ago, it was quite funny how you said, I dispute this claim that you say that every reference I have to Christianity in the letters of Thomas Jefferson, in the Federalist Papers, in the Declaration of Independence, and then stopped yourself and said, or I suppose, implied by the Declaration of Independence, because you pick an example where Christianity is not mentioned at all. It doesn't get a mention. And what I want to say is that although...
Yeah, but it's implicit. The Christianity is implicit, I agree.
The Creator is mentioned. I'll give you that much. Which,
well, it's not Ahura Mazda. We're not talking about some demiurge or something. I mean, presumably these men are talking about some creator, at least vaguely resembling the Christian God.
I'm going to imagine so too. However, I would say I'd refer to what I said a moment ago, which is that the founding fathers were geniuses in this regard of knowing exactly how much of their own worldview to put into the words on the page. So, although they may have been thinking of a Christian God, it may be that they think to themselves,
they might kill me right here.
Let's write this in such a way that if you don't have the same view of God that I do, you can still identify with this document, especially given that the founding fathers had completely and utterly different views of God, even just amongst the company that ended up making up the Constitutional Convention. But the reason that I'm drawing a comparison here to the Treaty of Tripoli is because, of course, the Declaration of Independence is, I mean, they don't have the Treaty of Tripoli, in Washington, D.C.
Halls
behind
of Congress,
4 inches of bulletproof glass. Right. Yeah. But the point that the way that you say, well, yeah, okay, so John Adams was writing that America isn't Christian, but he was just doing this essentially as a rhetorical tool to help serve the political end. That's maybe what I'm suggesting is happening in the Declaration of Independence. It's more relevant because, of course, it's the Declaration of Independence. But in the same way that when I was saying a moment ago, the Declaration of Independence is just this document that's supposed to inspire what is a predominantly Christian nation to revolution, he's going to say, yeah, endowed by their creator, even though really, that maybe isn't what he privately thinks, but he writes it because he's trying to achieve a political end.
I think
in
you
the same way that John Adams does that with the Treaty of Tripoli, the difference is that in the Treaty of Tripoli, John Adams specifically references Christianity, and in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson does not.
I think.
Hey, Southwest Montana, St. Patrick's Day is just around the corner, and we want everyone to have a good time responsibly.
Sip beverage, I think you've just made my point, though, accidentally, which is we have to consider who the Treaty of Tripoli is designed to persuade, a bunch of foreign Muslim pirates, and who the Declaration is designed to persuade. It's addressed to King George, but it's obviously to persuade the American colonists. So why is it that the Continental Congress believed that they had to appeal to broadly religious, red Christian principles to persuade the Americans? It's because they were broadly religious and, in fact, Christian. And they write about this too. So if your argument is some of these founding fathers, they might have pretended to be a bit more Christian than they actually were, I think you're probably right about that. But I think that also kind of proves my point, because when we talk about whether or not America is a Christian nation, I'm not even particularly concerned with the idle musings of Thomas Jefferson or even John Adams, who I prefer to Thomas Jefferson. I'm more concerned about that lowercase c Constitution. What kind of a country is this really in practice, beyond the declarations of a president or two, or even some of the elected representatives who perhaps have different views than most people? And I think this really gets us to Alexis de Tocqueville, who observes that America has a chasm between the way that it talks and the way that it acts. America talks in this very liberal, modern, fashionable way, but they behave in this really conservative, traditional, openly religious way. America has always been more religious than most of the West, and that's become especially true in recent years. And Tocqueville makes an interesting observation too, which is that he says America in the future will either follow secularism that exists. There's a little seed of secularism here. They will either follow that toward atheism, or they will follow the broad Christian culture toward the apotheosis of Christianity, which he said is Catholicism. Now, I think I've managed to upset every single person who's listening at this point, but Alexis de Tocqueville was a very wise man, and probably he has a point here, that the contradictions and the dissension that you're observing in the founding era, I think you're overstating the secular impulses here, but in any case, there was a little bit of that. Those ideas are going to follow themselves to a logical conclusion. So again, I'm not even arguing that America is a Christian nation, is now and ever shall be a Christian nation. I'm merely observing that America was founded as a Christian nation, going back in the early days of settlement. During the so-called founding era, it was still understood itself to be Christian. In the early century or two, century and a half of America, we understood ourselves to be Christian. And there has been a growing secularism and atheism that I think overstates the supposed secularism of the past.
I understand that the small c Constitution of America, at least with regards to its citizenry, let's say, it is historically certainly Christian. And I agree with you that that's why this reference to the Creator is put in the Declaration of Independence, to persuade a majority religious. They're at least going to believe in a Creator, and when they hear the word Creator, they're going to think of Christianity. And you're also right that it's become something of a truism that, people say this all the time about the UK and the US. They say, isn't it funny how the UK is officially a Christian country with an established church, and yet in practice so secular, and America is legally a secular nation, but in practice so religious. But it seems like you're disputing even that, because you wouldn't describe the legal America as secular at all. Because in other words, I have no problem saying that, yes, Americans speak and act differently, as everybody does, and I would characterize that as, in the founding documents, affirming a secular nation, and yet maybe in practice acting incredibly religiously, still allowing courthouses or state houses to put the Ten Commandments outside, this kind of stuff, eventually adopting the the motto of "In God We Trust," which, by the way, I mean, you mentioned that earlier. That only gets adopted in like the mid 20th century or something like that?
It's put into the. There's a common misconception. That motto is put into the what's it called? The Pledge of Allegiance. As a way to fight communism in the 20th century. But the motto itself long predates it. So we have the motto on our money, for instance, but the motto comes from the Star Spangled Banner. It actually comes from the national anthem, which is written in the middle of the 19th century by Francis Scott Key. Or I'm sorry, actually earlier than that. It comes from what it's referring to is the War of 1812. So the second battle with your country over there, which we won, by the way. And so that final stanza says, "This be our motto, and God is our trust."
Does he still live in? Does he still live in England, or is he? Does he live in America now?
Days of our country. It's not a song and an anthem about the Revolutionary War or even the French and Indian War, which predates it, but it is about the Second War of Independence, and so that idea had been long standing there, and so to your point, yes, America is practically more religious than any other country in the West, but even as a matter of law, we have been, and I guess the example I would point to. And the answer you would have to provide for the supposed secular founding is how it is that we had, for decades after the ratification, the established churches at the state level in a number of the states, and how it is that we've had until very recently in American history blasphemy laws. If this were a proper secular atheistic nation with no lawmaking that respects religion, how is it that blasphemy laws could endure for most of our nation's history?
I think there are a few ways to answer that question. The first is to suggest, I suppose the first is to suggest that you're completely right, and that America is not a secular nation, and it's entirely Christian. Fine, and I can see it being clipped. You know, if you wanted to upload a clip of this conversation on your channel and it ends there, just with me saying, well, I suppose you may just be completely right. You know, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
There's going to be a blurb on my next book. I suppose you're completely right, Alex O'Connor.
Yeah, well, we are doing something of an exercise in taking people's quotes out of context in this episode, it seems. Who's doing it more remains to be seen. The other answers might be, for example, that America is also ostensibly founded on notions of, look, the Declaration says that all men are created equal, and the man who writes those words owns hundreds of other people as private property in Virginia. Now, when somebody points to, like, I can point to Thomas Jefferson being a slave owner and writing in the founding documents of America that America is about equality. I would not say, therefore, that America isn't really about that. They didn't really have that in mind when they were writing those documents. They didn't really think that people should be equal. I would say that they did mean that. It's just that in practice they failed to live up to their own standards, and that's what made America such a great country. Is that they wrote.
I see that objection. I just think it's a little different than the blasphemy laws or, say, the blue laws. The Sabbath laws, which we actually still have in large parts of the United States, at least in large parts of New England. Because in the case of Thomas Jefferson, you're saying, here's a man who had an ideal, but it's a fallen world, and he's a fallen man, and he failed to live up to it. That's true. That describes all of us to some degree. But here, you're making a claim about the legal and political constitution of the country. And I'm pointing out that there are these laws throughout the country that have existed for most of our nation's history. There, it doesn't seem that it's just the matter of a few men failing to live up to their ideals. It raises this question, hold on, how did these laws get on the books in the first place? How were there established churches for decades after the ratification? How are there still blue laws and Sabbath laws today? And why did no one challenge these laws as being un-American or contrary to the spirit of our country until relatively recently, until the 20th century? That seems to be the historical problem for the secularist side.
Yeah, well, on that latter point, the fact that people sort of failed to pick up on this, I think that this is sort of what I'm driving at with the point about Thomas Jefferson, is that when a government actually does have either an essence or a strict legal system which runs contrary to something which you like and something which you enjoy. So in this case,
I think I'm going to be done for the day. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace.